Tēnā koutou, good morning, good evening. Thank you very much for having me here today to speak. Very much appreciated. I'm sorry I couldn't be there live, nasty time difference, but I'm very honoured to have been asked to address the Society on this topic of dairy's role in sustainable nutrition. Uh, in my talk, I'm going to discuss that theme across multiple scales, global, national, and individual. And as I can't be there to answer any questions, I'm going to try and be as comprehensive as I can uh, in this talk and hopefully leave you with nothing to ask at the end. Before I get into the main part of the talk, I did want to provide a bit of background about my team, the work that we do, and why we exist. So I'm part of the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, which is a research program at the Riddett Institute, Massey University in New Zealand. And we've been around since 2019, founded by the three gentlemen you can see on the slide, who were watching the global food system debate, and because they have a background in nutrition, were finding that it wasn't really putting enough emphasis on the nutrition aspect of sustainability, the need to feed everyone well into the future. Plenty of environmental narrative and economic narrative, but not enough on feeding people well. So the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative was really set up to champion nutrition in that debate and provide nutrition evidence for globally sustainable diets. The team has grown quite substantially since then, with myself and many other postdocs and students coming on board. And all of us have a focus on data, modeling, and providing that extra evidence for decisions to be made about the future of food. Now, when I say sustainable nutrition to different people, I get quite different responses. So I always think it's worth upfront in a talk really explaining what I mean by sustainable nutrition. The majority of people that you say sustainable nutrition to will immediately think about themselves. Me, what do I need to eat to have a healthy, sustainable, affordable, environmentally friendly diet? And that's a perfectly valid way to think about sustainable nutrition and really important. But it's not the only way. If I go down to our capital, Wellington, and I talk to the Ministry of Primary Industries about sustainable nutrition, they have quite a different take. To them, they're thinking about feeding the population, the New Zealand population, but also about their food exports, about having an economically and environmentally viable food system into the future. And then there's the really broad perspective. What does the world need to feed the world? Because we have a very hard border around the globe. We can't import and export any food in and out of the world. Everything that is needed to feed the global population has to come from somewhere on the planet. So the really big scale is, how does the world feed the world? And obviously connecting these different scales, we have things like food trade, food distribution. And all of these are very relevant, very important for the debate on sustainability of the food system and sustainable nutrition into the future. So we have to consider all of them. In my talk today, I'm going to work through these four scales, starting with the global and working all the way through to the individual, and talk about dairy's role in sustainable nutrition at each of those scales. So starting with the global, let's think about the global food system. Now, yes, the global food system is that linear progression from food production on farm, food harvesting from the oceans, through distribution, processing, and ultimately out to a consumer. But as shown in this extremely complex diagram and quite messy diagram, the food system is complex and quite messy. Surrounding that linear progression from food harvest through to consumption, we have many other dynamics that interfere with that linear progression. For example, we have environmental influences that determine what can be grown where, what yields we might get in a given year, And obviously we have the return effects of the food system on the environment. We also have the political and economic aspects of the food system that also determine what can be grown where it can be sent to, who can consume it, and what they have to pay for that. So an enormously complex system. And when we're thinking about a complex system like this, it can be really hard to ascertain whether or not it's sustainable, and if not, what changes might move it to be more sustainable in the future. And it's at this point, when we're tangled up in complexity, that we fall back on definitions that are really built on essential values. So what does a food system really need to do? At the heart of it, it must feed people. It must feed everyone, and it must feed them well. So that's food security and complete nutrition for all. That is the driving force of a sustainable food system, and very much the center of the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative's approach to our questions. But as well as feeding everyone, it has to do so in such a way that it's economically, environmentally, socially viable indefinitely into the future. So when I say sustainable and sustainable nutrition, I'm talking about far more than just environmental sustainability. And to think about the sustainability of the global food system, our team, with our background in nutrition and mathematical modeling, decided that you could actually build a model that would be useful for asking questions about how does the world feed the world? How does global food production translate to nutrition for the global population? And so we built the Delta model to capture that flow. Very quickly, how the model works is we start with global food production data. What left the farm gate, the fishery gate in a given year. From that, we then work out how much of that food was actually consumed by people, as opposed to being wasted, lost along the supply chain, used as animal feed, used for biofuel production, so on. We can then match that up to food composition data to understand the total nutrients consumed by the global population in a given year. And lastly, we can make some adjustments for nutrient bioavailability. So this is capturing the fact that 100 grams of dairy protein and 100 grams of wheat protein have very different value to the individual consuming them due to the different ability of our digestive system to digest and absorb the nutrients from within that. The protein, the amino acid from within that food. Thus, very different value, and the model is able to capture that bioavailability for protein and the amino acids, and to a certain extent for iron and zinc. Not able to go further into other essential nutrients due to limited understanding, limited data on how digestibility works for those nutrients. We can then compare that global amount of nutrient consumed in a given year with the nutrient requirements of the global population, calculated using demographic and nutrient reference values from various sources. So that lets us see how does global nutrient supply match up to the needs of the global population. Where are the gaps? Where are the surpluses? So what do we learn from this approach? Well, first of all, we can follow the mass flows through the food system. And there are a few numbers that are a little bit unintuitive that come out of this mass flow. So in terms of primary production, the world in 2020 produced a little under 11 billion tons of food commodity mass. A little over 9 billion tons of that was plant mass, of which about 1.5 billion tons were used as animal feed. Now, I'll emphasize here, we're talking about human edible food commodities here. So not grass, not soybean meal, that sort of thing, human edible food commodities. And that feed was used to produce about 1.5 billion tons of animal source foods. From that 11 billion tonnes, if we follow the chain through, deducting our waste, our non-food uses, we end up with a little under 5 billion tonnes actually being consumed as food. And we have about a 75-25 split of that mass between plant-sourced food and animal-sourced food. Lastly, we can pull all the waste mass together to see that about 1.4 billion tonnes of food commodity was wasted. This isn't processing losses or byproducts or anything like that. This is true losses and waste. And of that, over 90% was plant-sourced food material. But perhaps more interesting and more the driving force behind the Delta model was to look at the nutrition aspect. So this approach allows us to see for each of 29 essential nutrients in the human diet, shown along the bottom x-axis here, where are those nutrients coming from in the global diet? And here you can see color-coded by major food group. Now, immediate takeaway is that the dominant colors here are the gold for cereals and the two green colors, which are our fruits, vegetables, and other plant-sourced food. So as you'd probably expect, given 75% of food consumption is plant-sourced, for most nutrients, the majority of supply is coming from those plant sources. However, there are certainly exceptions. For example, vitamin B12 towards the right-hand side here, which is entirely coming out of animal sources and dominated by meat. And over on the far left-hand side, we have calcium, almost half of which comes from dairy. So almost half of global calcium supply coming from dairy system. This picture is probably more useful when we compare it to what the world needs. So now you're looking at the same data. All that's been done is it's been rescaled against global need, being the black horizontal line across the center of the chart. So what we can see here is that for most of the essential nutrients, supply is well in excess of global requirement. However, the further we move to the left-hand side, the closer and ultimately below the line some of these nutrients are falling. So things like iron and zinc, vitamin A, vitamin B12, global supply very much at the level of global requirement. However, for a couple of nutrients, calcium and vitamin E, we actually have an undersupply against global need. If I rearrange this chart slightly and simplify the colors, we can extract what the role of dairy looks like in global nutrient supply. So starting on the left-hand side, around half of global calcium supply is coming out of dairy. As we move to the right, between a quarter and a fifth of vitamin B2 and vitamin B12 supply coming from dairy, and really important contributions to a number of other nutrients, including the essential amino acids, protein, vitamin A, and several others. To put some more numbers around this, from the Delta model's analysis across nearly 100 food commodities in the FAO's food balance sheet that underpin the Delta model, dairy is the greatest single contributor to calcium, vitamin B2, dietary fat, and the essential amino acid lysine in the global food system. It's also one of the top 5 contributing commodities to 23 out of 29 of the nutrients included in the model. And if we were to talk about meeting global requirements, current dairy supply could meet around half global phosphorus requirement and around a third of the indispensable amino acids, so those constituent molecules of protein, around a third of global need. And what we can do with the model, as well as looking at the situation today, is simulate different situations for the future. So we're going to focus for a moment on energy and protein supply to the global population, which is shown by the colored bars in these two charts. The black horizontal line and the range bars give us an idea of where global requirement for these nutrients is. So in 2020, what the model shows us is that there was a global oversupply of both energy and protein compared to global requirement. Now, clearly, we know that this was not true for all individuals, for all populations. There are many that had insufficient energy and protein supply in 2020. What the model is showing us is that that's not due to insufficient global supply, but rather the inequity of distribution and access to food and nutrition that we see in the world. And with the model, we can think about future populations. So if we were to maintain 2020 food production out to 2030, where we're expected to have 8.5 billion individuals, we can see that global supply of energy and protein, while they would come down compared to global need, are still in excess of what is required. However, those are the macronutrients, and we see a quite different picture for the micronutrients. So as shown in previous slides, already in 2020, we see global supply gaps between calcium and vitamin E supply and need. And were we to keep the same food production system out to 2030, those gaps would grow, and we would also see a number of other gaps emerge, all for micronutrients, not in our analysis for any of the macronutrients, even after that adjustment for bioavailability. So to really hammer this point home, the charts you're seeing on the left-hand side are for protein supply in 2020, it's the first bar, and then protein supply against requirement in 2050 if food production was kept the same as it is today. So global supply still sitting above that global requirement bar. So it is the micronutrients rather than the macronutrients that become limiting first. And indeed, it's the micronutrients for which we're seeing dairy playing a significant role today. And we can also ask questions about food waste. So with this modeling tool, we can simulate scenarios where food waste is completely eliminated and see what that does for global nutrient supply. As you can see in these charts, for the macronutrients, for energy, for protein supply, it makes a quite enormous difference in terms of availability. However, it would not resolve our existing micronutrient gaps. Brings them down, but does not eliminate them. The reason for that is that we waste very different amounts or different proportions of different foods. Therefore, we're wasting different amounts of the nutrients within them. I showed early in the talk that over 90% of food losses and waste today are coming out of plant sources. Therefore, we see higher waste of the nutrients that are associated with those plant source foods and lower waste of the nutrients associated with animal source foods. So in this chart, we're seeing the percentage of what the world needs for each of the 29 nutrients that is currently wasted or lost. And while we have a huge range with some nutrients up in the above 60%, things like calcium, like vitamin B12, and like vitamin E, for which we have nutrient gaps, we're wasting only 10 to 15% of what the world needs. Therefore, the effectiveness of removing and reducing food waste for addressing these gaps is quite limited. And you can see across this chart that the role of dairy in global nutrient waste is quite minimal. Dairy waste is relatively small compared to the other food groups, but that doesn't mean it's not important for many other reasons beyond nutrition. And of course, as I always get asked when giving this sort of talk to this sort of audience, Can you use the model to eliminate food groups and see what the consequences are? Absolutely. Here we're looking at a simulation using the delta model of a world without dairy. The charts show the macronutrients, energy, protein, and fat, and while we can see that the removal of dairy has made a substantial difference to supply of those nutrients, they are still sitting above global requirement. But below the charts, I have called out the micronutrients for which nutrient gaps would emerge and the magnitude of those gaps. So for calcium, only a third of what the world needs would remain. And we also see it for vitamin B2, vitamin A, vitamin B12, and remaining gap for vitamin E. So dairy has a really important role in the current supply of nutrients, in particular of micronutrients at that global level. So, given that global context, what does that mean for the future? We see this calcium gap. How should it be addressed? Should we drastically increase dairy production to try and bridge it? Or should we take some other approach? Really good questions, but questions that can't be answered just at the global level. We need the context of the other scales, the national, the trade, and the individual. So I'm now going to move from the global scale to the distribution of nutrition at a country level. So another chart for you, and this one again based on the same data as previous ones. We have our 29 nutrients and we're comparing supply, which is the green bars, against global need, or against need, which is the black horizontal bar. The difference is we now have these error bars sitting on each nutrient. What that is showing is how supply of these nutrients varies between countries. So while the green bar shows the global average, the error bars showing the best and least availability of each nutrient. When we start to take that into consideration, we're seeing there are far more nutrients which are problematic in terms of supply against requirement in many countries in the world. I'll use South Africa as an example of how we can think about this distribution of nutrition and this national level nutrient supply. So in 2020, South Africa produced around 42 grams of protein per person per day. That's shown on the left-hand side here. You can see that a large chunk of that protein is meat and a smaller chunk is dairy, with a reasonable amount of cereals and the other food groups also. What the South African population needs on an average per capita per day basis is about 45 grams, so slightly more than is produced, and shown by the black horizontal bar over here. And the coloured bar behind it shows that what the population is consuming is in excess of that requirement. And the pattern of what it consists of in terms of meat, dairy, and cereals is similar to the pattern of production. Trade accounts for the difference between the two. So South Africa has quite substantial cereal imports or cereal protein imports and smaller protein exports, ultimately leaving it with that supply in excess of need as shown by the right-hand bar. I'll also note that this dashed line here is the global average protein supply. So South Africa a little below the global average in terms of protein supply. And when we look at supply of all 29 of these essential nutrients, we can see quite a different picture emerging for South Africa compared to the global picture. So if we start on the right-hand side, for example, vitamin B12 here, which was one of the nutrients that was at and around requirement at the global level, In South Africa, well in excess due to quite substantial meat consumption. Probably not a surprise to anyone in the audience today. But if we move to the left-hand end of the chart, we can see several nutrients that are falling short of national requirement. Things, again, that probably are relatively unsurprising: iron, zinc, dietary fiber, and also calcium. The calcium gap in South Africa substantially larger than that global calcium gap, even though more than half of current supply is coming out of dairy. So what does that mean for South Africa? What should South Africa do to address these nutrient gaps? I am not the right person to answer that question. I don't have the knowledge, the local understanding that's needed. But this sort of data should be really useful to those that do, to inform interventions, future planning for the national food system. And whether that should come from changes to production or changes to trade is also a really valid question. So next I'm going to show some of our work on modeling nutrient trade and how that fits in the sustainable nutrition picture. So this comes out of some work that we did in collaboration with the University of Sao Paulo over the last 2 to 3 years, where we took global food trade data and converted it into global nutrient trade data, which allows us to interrogate for any country what are its food and nutrient trade relationships, which countries are most important for supply of nutrients via imports or via exports, and what foods is that nutrition embedded in. So again, we'll stick with the example of South Africa. What you're viewing here is South African calcium imports with the top 10 trade partner countries. So we can see that in the left-hand side here, the Russian Federation accounts for a little over 10% of South African calcium imports, and as shown by the green color, that's almost exclusively in the form of wheat. As we move down the list, we see wheat playing a really important role, but also some dairy products, particularly from France and New Zealand, appearing in number 9 spot, very much from dairy. So South Africa's calcium imports, quite diverse, both in terms of trade partner country and in terms of food commodity coming in. However, South Africa imports less than 10% of its calcium requirement. So calcium imports, at least, have only a minor role in supply of calcium against population need. And we can also flip and think about calcium exports. Again, we see that these are quite diverse in terms of trade partners and also the traded commodity. And also the countries have changed. There's far more African countries on the list here than there were for the imports. But once again, South Africa exports less than 10% of its calcium requirements. So it's not like there's a huge amount of this essential nutrient flowing out across the border. Therefore, calcium trade has only a minor role in calcium balance for South Africa. Again, whether that is optimal, what one would choose to change about that, really requires local knowledge, but this sort of data is all openly accessible on the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative website to feed those conversations. Now coming to the last part of my talk, where I get into discussing the individual perspective on sustainable nutrition. What should an individual eat to have a healthy, nutritious, affordable, and environmentally sustainable diet? This is a question that in the field we're seeing asked more and more and in many, many different ways. And you have people who are trying to design the entire global food system from a diet up. and likewise trying to design diets based on what the global food system can produce within environmental constraints. At the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, we're building a sustainable diet model at present, but it's not quite ready to show results yet. We hope to have it up online for anyone to use later this year. What I'm going to walk through today is what I think are some really telling results from the literature that will very much echo what our own modelling will show once public. So there are many ways to ask this sustainable diet question. I'm going to start from the simple and work up. So some of my colleagues at the Rudyard Institute a few years ago asked the question of, for the US, what's the cheapest way to get the nutrition required? It's the least cost, nutrient adequate diet. And what they found was that milk was the largest component by mass of this optimized diet. And it was also really difficult to get rid of from this optimized diet. Even if the price of milk increased eightfold, it was still appearing in that minimum cost nutrient adequate diet. They then repeated that work, but with the New Zealand setting, New Zealand data, very similar results. And it was also telling that milk was not the most expensive part of this diet, despite the fact it was the largest constituent of it. A larger analysis asking the same question, so still least cost nutrient adequate diets, but this time across 177 countries, found real differences depending on the income level of that country. In the high income countries, the upper middle income countries, they echoed the previous results. Milk was a really important part of those optimized diets. But in the lower middle and lower income countries, you didn't see milk appearing. It was too expensive relative to other sources of nutrition. So a real income aspect to these conclusions. A UK study extended this sort of thinking into environmental impact. So started putting emissions limits on these optimized diets. And what they found was that, yes, in these optimized diets with no constraint, milk was the largest part. And actually it remained the largest part of the diet, even when you brought that constraint down to up to a 36% lower emissions associated with the diet than today, and without a change in retail cost. A French study asking the question in a slightly different way found that as you made that emissions limit more and more strict, the amount of milk in the diet actually increased at the expense of things like meat, other dairy products, and the discretionary food, the sugary sweets and snacks. And as shown here, a diet with half the emissions of the current French diet had twice as much milk in it to supply those essential micronutrients. As I mentioned, we're building our own tool that will allow you to ask these questions around nutrition, around environmental impact, acceptability of the diet to consumers in terms of how far it deviates from their current diet, and affordability at the supermarket checkout. And this will be an open access model up on our website later this year. That brings me to the end of my talk. And the main take-home message that I really want to hammer is that sustainability is a really broad concept. And when we're talking about sustainability of the food system, nutrition is a key and essential part of sustainability. The role of dairy in a sustainable food system really varies depending on the scale and the setting that you're asking the question at. If we're thinking about the global food system, dairy has a really important role in global supply, particularly of micronutrients. And we would see even larger and new nutrient gaps emerging at the global level in the absence of dairy. If we come down to a national level, to an individual level, the role of dairy really varies depending on the country that we're looking at. In the higher income countries, an essential part of nutrition and really hard to get rid of. Even if we're putting in emissions constraints, environmental constraints, cost constraints, dairy plays a really important role. But it's a different story for lower income countries where relative price of dairy makes a huge difference to its role in sustainable nutrition. But ultimately, while we hear a lot about dairy protein, the importance of dairy protein, at a global and in most cases, for most countries at a national level, it's not protein or the macronutrients, but the micronutrients that are limiting and that are most important when we're thinking about the role of dairy in sustainable nutrition. I'll stop there. I'd like to thank our collaborators that have made this work all possible and refer you on to the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative website, sustainablenutritioninitiative.com, if you would like to use any of the models I've talked about today. They're all openly accessible on the website, as are a number of articles about our work and similar work in the field. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I'll happily take any questions via email that I have not addressed in my talk. Thank you.